The 83-second reckoning. A forensic analysis of administrative accountability. Consider with the most profound attention the specific financial quantification that effectively precipitated the terminal decline of Attorney General Pam Bondi's professional, standing in a mere 83-second interval, exactly $847,000. On the afternoon of the 19th of December 2025, which occurred precisely 3 weeks prior to this current moment, Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a formidable collection of forensic legal documentation before the assembled halls of Congress, ostensibly validating that Bondi had been the recipient of $847,000 through a series of intricate wire transfers connected to specific international interests. These transfers were allegedly facilitated through offshore shell corporations, while Bondi simultaneously advocated for administrative policies that served to protect the very financial networks involved in such cross-border capital movements. Bondi evidently did not anticipate that Senator Warren would have successfully secured classified Treasury Department FinCEN reports that meticulously catalogued 4 distinct capital transfers originating from Baltec Holdings Limited in Nicosia. These substantial funds were subsequently routed through the infrastructure of Riatumu Banka in Riga, Latvia, a financial institution previously flagged by international regulatory bodies for its involvement in the circumvention of global sanctions, to an undisclosed Delaware-based limited liability company registered under the name of Bondi's former legal associate. Warren appeared entirely unsurprised by the profound silence that manifested when she requested Attorney General Bondi to clarify the nature of her 47-minute meeting with Dmitry Volkov, a dual national representing certain international banking subsidiaries, on the 28th of November. Following that private encounter, the aforementioned Delaware entity was dissolved the very next day. The digital encryption keys for 19 confidential electronic communiques were purged 24 hours later, and 5 years of official financial disclosure forms were amended within 72 hours, notably excluding any specific reference to international capital infusions. What did this brief but historically significant 83-second revelation before Congress unveil regarding the allegations that Attorney General Bondi's official policy positions were influenced by these specific interests, potentially rendering her liable for violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the provision of inaccurate statements to federal investigators, and potential legal repercussions for declining to provide transparent answers under oath regarding evidence that could trigger a full-scale criminal prosecution? The scene unfolded at precisely 2:47 p.m. on the 19th of December 2025, within the high-ceilinged environment of the Senate Judiciary Committee, located in the Hart Senate Office Building. The scheduled oversight hearing had been organized as a routine, perfunctory end-of-year session intended to examine the standard administrative operations of the Department of Justice. Attorney General Pam Bondi occupied the witness table, dressed in a formal navy blue suit, with her hands positioned with practiced, bureaucratic confidence, expecting the usual range of inquiries regarding litigation, statistics, and annual budgetary allocations. Throughout her extensive and distinguished public career, she had participated in numerous congressional testimonies, developing a refined and tactical ability to navigate adversarial questioning through the use of calculated deflection and legalistic ambiguity. However, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts was seated 3 places from the committee chairman, clutching a navy blue folder containing the specific forensic evidence that would fundamentally challenge Bondi's career in less than 2 minutes. The former academic and consumer protection advocate had spent the preceding 6 weeks collaborating with investigators from the Treasury Department to secure highly classified FinCEN reports that documented systematic capital movements through Baltic financial institutions, building a methodical and inescapable case that left no margin for strategic evasion. At precisely 2:48 p.m., Chairman Dick Durbin formally recognized Senator Warren for her line of questioning. A palpable sense of expectant quietude descended upon the chamber as Warren opened her file with the deliberate and surgical focus of a prosecutor preparing to present a high-stakes case to a grand jury. "Bondi," Warren began, her voice possessing the controlled tranquility of an interlocutor who holds a complete and unassailable set of facts. During the time frame, spanning from March through November of this current calendar year, were any official or unofficial communications from foreign nationals received by you concerning policy considerations relevant to your public responsibilities? This was an intentionally foundational and standard opening question designed to establish a baseline of sworn testimony. Bondi shifted forward slightly in her chair, projecting an air of professional certainty as she replied that official channels receive hundreds of such messages monthly, all of which are supposedly reviewed and catalogued by her legal counsel as per established federal regulations. Warren's focus remained fixed on the contents of the blue folder as she refined her inquiry, asking specifically about communications originating from entities with direct connections to international intermediaries. Bondi maintained her composed demeanor, stating that no such communications were known to her within the context of her official capacity. Warren then progressed to the next page of her file, introducing the initial piece of legal documentation that would directly challenge that assertion, asking if the name Baltec Holdings Limited, a firm registered in the jurisdiction of Nicosia, Cyprus, held any significance for the witness. The subsequent pause in Bondi's reply lasted just long enough to signal a moment of internal recalibration, a subtle hesitation that Warren, with her decades of experience in the art of cross-examination, immediately identified as a precursor to a defensive maneuver. Bondi eventually suggested that her official records would require a thorough and exhaustive review to provide an accurate answer to such a specific inquiry. Warren immediately offered her assistance in this matter, producing a single document that served as a matter of public and forensic record: 4 specific wire transfers directed to a Delaware limited liability company that had been flagged by the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The registration for that specific entity listed the name of Bondi's former law partner as the registered agent, with Baltec Holdings Limited identified as the originating source of the capital. Warren paused for a significant duration, allowing the weight of the offshore connection to settle within the hearing room before delivering the devastating details of the transaction. The intermediary for these transactions was Riatumu Banka, located in Riga, Latvia, a bank specifically noted by regulatory bodies for facilitating the movement of sensitive capital and the evasion of international sanctions. The specific dates for these transfers were recorded as March 14, April 22, June 8, and the 3rd of September 2025, at exactly 2:49 p.m. Just 60 seconds into the inquiry, Warren disclosed the figures that would define the ensuing controversy. Individual amounts of $178,000, $223,000, $251,000, and $215,000. These figures totaled $847,000 in transfers connected to an entity associated with the nation's highest law enforcement officer, causing a palpable wave of shock to move through the gallery and the press corps. While Bondi remained physically still, her visible tension was captured clearly by the high-definition cameras broadcasting the event to a national audience, marking the beginning of an irreversible administrative collapse. Part 2. The Erosion of Administrative Plausibility. The legal dissolution of the aforementioned Delaware-based limited liability company was formally recorded on the 29th of November, an occurrence that took place a mere 3 weeks prior to this session and just days before the commencement of this scheduled oversight inquiry a timing that inevitably invites rigorous scrutiny regarding the strategic intent behind such a sudden cessation of corporate existence. In the presence of these highly specific data points, Senator Warren directly interrogated whether the Attorney General wished to recalibrate her foundational testimony, which had initially asserted a complete lack of awareness or connection to any communications involving international intermediaries or the financial networks in question. However, no immediate verbal denial was forthcoming from Bondi at that critical juncture, nor did any corrective clarification follow to mitigate the mounting implications of the documented wire transfers. A profound and heavy silence permeated the congressional chamber as Warren's evidentiary documents were placed precisely upon the witness table with the text facing upward, fully visible to every high-definition camera lens, currently documenting the proceedings, effectively transforming the private records into an undeniable matter of public record. In a choreographed movement of administrative transparency, a staff assistant positioned a large-scale digital monitoring display within the primary broadcast frame of the various media networks, and the authoritative FinCEN report began to materialize on the screen before the collective gaze of the committee. Although the specific identities of the originating senders were obscured by editorial redactions intended to preserve the integrity of sensitive intelligence-gathering methodologies, the specific financial quantifications regarding the capital flow remained displayed with absolute, unyielding precision. Complex banking transaction codes appeared in sequence alongside the documented chains of correspondent financial institutions, illustrating a sophisticated and circuitous route of capital movement that originated in Tallinn, Estonia, proceeded through the regulatory environment of Riga, Latvia, and finally concluded its journey within the corporate registries of Wilmington, Delaware. Senator Warren continued to intensify the pressure of her inquiry, her voice assuming a sharper and more resonant quality with each subsequent question, as every element of her argument was reinforced by the mounting pile of verified forensic documentation. She emphasized that on the 9th of June, 2025, the date immediately following the third documented capital infusion of $251,000, the official government record confirmed Bondi's active participation in a non-public executive session of the Senate Banking Committee regarding the rigorous enforcement of international financial sanctions. When asked if she could recall the specific deliberations of that particular meeting, Bondi attempted to deflect the inquiry with a generalized assertion that a high volume of meetings occurred during that exceptionally busy administrative window. However, Warren immediately countered with a level of specificity that appeared to stun the witness, clarifying that this particular session focused explicitly on the tightening of correspondent banking regulations for financial institutions located in the Baltic region that had been flagged for their involvement in large-scale international capital laundering operations. Most significantly, Rietumu Banka, the very institution responsible for facilitating the processing of the payments linked to the Attorney General, had been the primary subject of discussion during that specific session, and the official policy stance articulated by Bondi during those proceedings expressed a firm opposition to the implementation of additional regulatory restrictions. These proposed restrictions would have logically disrupted the very financial conduits that were allegedly providing a direct capital benefit to the undisclosed limited liability company associated with her former associate. Warren's subsequent inquiry regarding whether this detailed information served to refresh the witness's memory triggered a visible physiological response, as Bondi's hand extended toward her water glass but abruptly halted mid-motion. She withdrew her hand and returned it to the table without completing the action, a physical manifestation of psychological paralysis that was captured in exhaustive detail by the live broadcast cameras. She could only offer a fragile and unconvincing explanation that her contributions to that session were merely centered on the theoretical feasibility of the proposed regulations, while her previously impenetrable air of professional confidence seemed to have completely evaporated into the tense atmosphere of the room. Warren then proceeded to turn another page in her folder, unveiling further legal evidence, suggesting that these occurrences were the result of a systematic coordination rather than mere administrative coincidence. An encrypted electronic communication had reached the Attorney General's personal server 4 days prior to that critical banking committee meeting, with the originating IP address traced back to a secure server infrastructure in Tallinn, Estonia. Although the subject line of the communiqué contained no identifying text, it featured a single PDF attachment titled as "A Confidential Impact Assessment Regarding the Future of Correspondent Banking Regulations." That document contained specific projections regarding potential revenue diminishment for 3 major financial institutions in Latvia, with Rietumu Banka explicitly identified as one of the primary entities at risk. Warren's gaze transitioned from the document to fix directly upon the witness, posing a direct question as to whether that specific communication had been reported to the relevant Ethics Oversight Committee as mandated by federal transparency laws. The response was a prolonged and agonizing silence, the type of silence that carries far more weight than a verbal denial before a national audience of millions. As Bondi had offered testimony in opposition to the enforcement of the sanctions, Warren continued to construct her prosecutorial narrative based on these unanswered questions, asking whether the offshore transfers that allegedly benefited from her policy advocacy were ever disclosed to this specific committee of oversight. The musculature in Bondi's jaw tightened visibly as the realization that the connection between the secret funds and the financial institution she had defended was becoming impossible to refute in a public forum. She eventually managed to state that such a connection had not been identified by her at the time, an excuse that appeared conspicuously inadequate to the observers in the room. Senator Warren responded with a measured but devastating observation, pointing out that as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, the claim that she failed to notice she was advocating for the exact foreign banks that were allegedly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to an entity connected to her was an explanation that defied the boundaries of administrative logic. Here is part 3 of 6 of the expanded narrative. This section analyzes the specific policy interference on September 4th, the linguistic choices used in official correspondence to mask the alleged corruption, and the forensic metadata regarding the destruction of encrypted evidence. Part 3. The Architecture of Regulatory Obstruction. At precisely 2:50 p.m., exactly 83 seconds after the commencement of her inquiry, Senator Warren introduced the specific evidentiary link that would effectively render a subsequent criminal prosecution a foreseeable inevitability. This evidence centered on the events of the 4th of September 2025, the date immediately following the 4th and final documented capital transfer of $215,000. On that very afternoon, an electronic communiqué originated from the Attorney General's official Department of Justice account, directed toward a high-ranking Deputy Assistant Secretary within the Department of the Treasury. The subject line of this correspondence was marked with an unmistakable urgency, titled as a critical review of the proposed expansion of FinCEN enforcement protocols. Within this communication, Bondi's official position was used to formally request an administrative delay regarding new reporting requirements that were specifically intended to target shell corporations receiving international payments through Baltic-based correspondent banking institutions. Warren proceeded to read Bondi's own professional prose into the congressional record, highlighting a series of justifications that appeared, in retrospect, to be meticulously constructed to protect the witness's private financial interests. The Attorney General had characterized these new transparency mandates as an unnecessary allocation of enforcement resources toward what she termed as low-risk technical violations. Furthermore, she argued that such rigorous compliance burdens possessed the potential to destabilize legitimate cross-border business structures, a phrase that would soon become a centerpiece of the legal challenges against her. As the printed document was placed upon the table with a sense of finality, Warren observed that the phrase low-risk technical violations was a remarkable choice of words to describe a mechanism that was simultaneously facilitating nearly $1 million in undisclosed transfers to an entity connected to the nation's chief law enforcement officer. Throughout this recitation of her own official words, Bondi's breathing pattern appeared to slow to a point of near immobility, her eyes remaining fixed on a point in the distance, as she struggled to maintain her composure under the weight of the prosecutorial narrative. The silence that followed this revelation was not merely a lapse in conversation, but rather a profound evidentiary void that Bondi seemed unable to fill. Warren observed that the Attorney General was not engaging in a broad discussion regarding the merits of regulatory architecture or administrative efficiency. Rather, she was allegedly utilizing the prestige and power of her office to protect the precise financial channels that were processing her clandestine income from international sources. When no response materialized before the committee or the assembled media, Warren transitioned toward the presentation of evidence regarding what she characterized as an active and systematic cover-up, an action that could independently trigger charges of obstruction of justice and contempt of Congress. The focus of the inquiry then shifted to 19 separate encrypted electronic messages that had arrived at Bondi's personal server between the months of March and October 2025. Forensic analysis of the metadata revealed that these messages originated from servers located in Estonia, Cyprus, and a data center in Moscow, with access to these communiques occurring through a virtual private network service registered within the jurisdiction of the British Virgin Islands. Not a single one of these communications had been recorded in the official Department of Justice communication logs, a direct violation of the stringent requirements established by federal record-keeping statutes. Warren emphasized that while the actual linguistic content of these messages remained currently inaccessible to investigators, the metadata provided an undeniable trail of digital breadcrumbs documenting access timestamps and originating IP address ranges with high resolution. The most damning detail, however, involved the temporal proximity of the destruction of the encryption keys, which occurred on the 30th of November, exactly 1 day after the dissolution of the Delaware LLC, and a mere 48 hours after Bondi's private meeting with the dual national intermediary, Dmitry Volkov. Senator Warren paused, allowing the gravity of this timeline to resonate with the committee members and the public, asking directly who had provided the administrative instruction for the purge of those encryption keys. When silence remained the only answer, the inquiry moved toward the question of who had directed the sudden dissolution of the limited liability company. Warren then produced additional legal documentation showing that, on the 2nd of December, 3 days after the digital purge, Bondi had submitted a series of amendments to 5 years of her official federal financial disclosure forms. A small, inconspicuous footnote had been added to these documents, referencing a source of consultancy income that was purportedly under review, yet the specific dollar amounts remained absent, and the name of the LLC was never explicitly stated. Furthermore, these amended filings contained absolutely no mention of the international capital transfers. Despite the clear and unambiguous requirements of federal transparency laws regarding the disclosure of foreign-sourced income, the senator looked directly at the witness and asked what specific event or realization had prompted these sudden and extensive amendments to her financial records just 3 weeks prior to this scheduled oversight hearing. Bondi's fingers appeared to compress slightly against one another as she managed a single, barely audible response, suggesting that the amendments were the result of advice provided by her legal counsel. When pressed to identify the specific external compliance counsel who had provided such advice, Bondi hesitated once more, stating that she would need to consult her records to provide a name. In a move of calculated dramatic timing, Warren interrupted this deflection by placing a high-resolution photograph on the table, identifying the individual as Dmitry Volkov. She noted that Volkov, who possesses dual U.S.-Russian citizenship and is based in Miami, leads a firm that has represented specific banking subsidiaries in multiple sanctions evasion cases. The very same department that Bondi led was currently investigating his firm for violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This direct conflict of interest, illustrated by a photograph of Bondi's in-person meeting with Volkov at an Arlington hotel on November 28th, served to bridge the final gap between the secret payments and the official policy advocacy. Here is part 4 of 6 of the expanded narrative. This section focuses on the definitive link between the Nicosia-based BC Strategy Group and the Attorney General's official actions, the final moments of the 83-second forensic exposure, and the immediate legal and political repercussions following the hearing. Part 4. The final convergence of forensic evidence. As the inquiry reached its most critical juncture, Senator Warren turned the final page of the navy blue folder, revealing a record that bridged the gap between private consultancy and public policy interference. The official schedule of the Attorney General contained an entry dated the 7th of June 2025 at 3:30 p.m., documenting a conference call with an entity identified as BC Strategy. When Warren posed the question of whether Bondi was familiar with this organization, the Attorney General's posture remained unnervingly rigid, her silence serving as a prelude to a more devastating disclosure. Warren observed, for the record, that BC Strategy is a consulting group based in Nicosia, Cyprus, whose physical and registered address is identical to that of Baltec Holdings, the very entity that had facilitated the transfer of $847,000 to the undisclosed LLC. The forensic timeline established by this legal evidence demonstrated a sequence of events that appeared to defy any possibility of administrative coincidence. The call with BC Strategy, which lasted exactly 34 minutes, preceded the receipt of the encrypted policy assessment by precisely 24 hours. Furthermore, this communication occurred just 48 hours before Bondi's high-profile testimony before the Senate Banking Committee, where she advocated against the very sanctions that would have impacted the financial institutions processing her secret payments. Warren emphasized that no official ethics review documented this call, no federal disclosure filing recorded its occurrence, and no official Department of Justice log accounted for the discussion of policy matters with a foreign-based consulting firm. This lack of transparency, coupled with the immediate financial reward that followed, formed the basis of what Warren characterized as a direct and undocumented influence on United States policy. What specific discussion occurred during that 34-minute communication, Miss Bondi? Warren's voice carried the full weight of her constitutional authority as she waited for a response that never materialized. 10 seconds of absolute silence elapsed, followed by 20 and then 30, as the quietude in the Hart Senate office building became an evidentiary answer in itself. The Attorney General's gaze remained fixed on the table, her inability to provide an explanation for the timing of the call and the subsequent capital infusion, serving as a silent admission of the severity of the situation. Warren then pivoted to a more foundational inquiry, asking whether any requests to influence American policy in exchange for monetary compensation had ever originated from international or internationally linked entities during Bondi's tenure. The Attorney General finally raised her eyes, attempting to regain a modicum of composure, stating that she had never acted as a formal representative for any foreign government. However, Warren was quick to observe that the question was not whether Bondi had officially registered as a foreign agent, but whether she had participated in the underlying conduct that necessitated such registration under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The silence resumed once more, casting a long shadow over the proceedings as Warren lifted her pen to finalize the committee's next steps. She announced that formal subpoenas would be issued immediately for all communications involving Baltec Holdings, BC Strategy, and the intermediary Dmitry Volkov, including exhaustive phone records, electronic messages, and 3 years of comprehensive financial data. Furthermore, a formal referral to the Department of Justice would be initiated to investigate potential violations of FARA, the provision of false statements to Congress, and the possible obstruction of an active investigation. The final moments of the 83-second reckoning concluded with the folding of the blue folder and a definitive directive. Warren informed the witness that she would be required to return under oath on the 14th of January, exactly 5 days from that moment, to provide the transparency that had been absent during the current session. She warned that any subsequent failure to provide accurate information would result in a criminal perjury referral and potentially include charges for contempt of Congress. As Senator Warren stood to depart, Bondi remained in her seat, her hands still positioned near the untouched water glass, her eyes fixed forward as the reality of the forensic exposure began to set in. Beyond the confines of the hearing room, the corridors were teeming with members of the press. Yet Bondi transitioned through the hallway without offering a single comment to the assembled journalists. The afternoon was marked by the rapid issuance of legal subpoenas, setting the stage for the January 14th return. The narrative of the $847,000 in transfers, the 19 purged electronic messages, and the 47-minute encounter with a foreign intermediary had been woven into a single, inescapable tapestry of evidence. The 83 seconds in which Warren exposed these financial details had effectively dismantled the defense of an attorney general who could not answer a single substantive question regarding the alleged sale of American policy. Interests. Part V. The infrastructure of opacity and the bureaucratic backlash. The subsequent investigation into the internal architecture of the Delaware-based limited liability company revealed a structural design specifically intended to maximize administrative anonymity. This entity, which had served as the recipient of the $847,000, utilized a registered agent system that effectively shielded the identities of its ultimate beneficial owners from standard public inquiry. Legal experts analyzing the case noted that the use of such a corporate veil is a characteristic feature of modern financial layering, where multiple tiers of ownership are established to distance the source of capital from its eventual destination. In the specific instance of the Attorney General, the forensic trail suggested that the LLC was not merely a passive holding company, but a sophisticated conduit designed to absorb international transfers without triggering the standard transparency mandates typically associated with high-ranking public officials. Furthermore, the specific details contained within the FinCEN Suspicious Activity Reports, SARS, provided a granular view of the Know Your Customer, KYC, failures that occurred at Riatumu Banka in Latvia. These reports, which were allegedly secured by Senator Warren's investigative team through a series of highly classified disclosures, documented a pattern of non-compliance with the travel rule, a foundational international standard requiring financial institutions to transmit specific information regarding the origin and destination of wire transfers. The SARS highlighted that the transfers to the Delaware LLC were characterized by rapid movement of funds and lack of an apparent economic purpose, two primary red flags that typically warrant an immediate freeze of assets. The fact that these transactions were permitted to proceed through the Baltic banking corridor, while the Attorney General was actively advocating for the deregulation of that very corridor, became the central focus of the Department of Justice's internal ethics probe. The political reaction from the White House was immediate and characterized by a strategic attempt to frame the hearing as a coordinated administrative ambush. Sources within the executive branch indicated that the president's primary legal advisors were initially caught off guard by the depth of the forensic evidence presented by Senator Warren. In the hours following the hearing, a series of defensive statements were issued, characterizing the FinCEN reports as politically weaponized intelligence and asserting that the Attorney General had been the victim of a breach of classified protocol. However, this defense was complicated by the parallel investigation launched by the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR. This internal watchdog began an expedited review of Bondi's ethics agreement, questioning whether the receipt of funds from an entity linked to a foreign-based consulting firm constituted a material breach of her pledge to avoid specific conflicts of interest involving her former associates. As the administrative pressure mounted, the focus shifted to the Delaware shell itself, with investigators looking into whether the company had filed accurate tax returns or if it had been utilized for further layering of assets. The legislative community in Washington began to buzz with rumors of an impending resignation, as even Bondi's most staunch allies within the Senate Judiciary Committee appeared hesitant to offer a full-throated defense in the face of the documented wire transfers. The silence from the White House counsel's office was particularly notable, suggesting that the administration was evaluating the potential legal liability of maintaining a chief law enforcement officer who was now the subject of a multi-front investigation involving foreign agent registration and financial transparency. The 83-second reckoning had not only challenged Bondi's individual standing, but had also initiated a broader systemic crisis regarding the integrity of federal oversight and the mechanisms used to prevent foreign prodders. Influence within the highest echelons of the American government. Part 6. The Final Adjudication and the Constitutional Legacy. The dawn of the 14th of January, 2026, brought with it a level of atmospheric tension within the District of Columbia that had not been witnessed since the turn of the century. The Hart Senate Office Building, specifically the cavernous hearing room of the Senate Judiciary Committee, became the focal point of an international legal drama that would eventually be characterized by historians as the January 14th showdown. As the clocks throughout the Capitol complex struck 9 a.m., Attorney General Pam Bondi entered the chamber not with the practiced bureaucratic ease of her previous testimonies, but with a deliberate, armored posture that signaled a transition from administration to litigation. This final encounter was no longer an inquiry into Department of Justice statistics. It was a constitutional confrontation regarding the very definition of sovereign integrity and the limits of executive immunity. Senator Elizabeth Warren, having spent the intervening 5 days coordinating with a specialized team of forensic auditors and constitutional scholars, opened the proceedings with a document that effectively neutralized the defense of administrative coincidence. This was the unredacted version of the FinCEN Suspicious Activity Reports, SARS, which had been secured through an emergency subpoena of the correspondent banking records. These documents provided the definitive proof that the $300,000 capital movement through the Nicosia-based entity was not a consulting fee, but was explicitly categorized by the internal compliance officers of Riatumu Banca as consideration for specific legislative advocacy. The forensic linguistic match between the private BC strategy communiques and the official Department of Justice policy memos presented an undeniable pattern of what legal scholars termed quid pro quo administrative interference. The climax of the 83-second Reckoning sequel occurred when Warren introduced a series of decrypted electronic messages that had been recovered from a secondary server infrastructure in Estonia. These messages, which Bondi's team had mistakenly believed were permanently deleted during the November 30th purge, contained explicit instructions regarding the strategic delay of the Treasury Department's enforcement expansion. The linguistic content of these messages shattered the veneer of low-risk technical violations that Bondi had attempted to construct. Instead, they revealed a calculated effort to maintain the viability of the very offshore channels that were facilitating the $847,000 in transfers. As the evidence materialized on the committee's digital displays, the Attorney General's silence transitioned from a tactical maneuver to a profound legal liability, eventually leading to her formal invocation of her constitutional right against self-incrimination. The immediate legal resolution of this crisis was as swift as it was consequential. Within 48 hours of the January 14th testimony, the House of Representatives initiated formal impeachment proceedings, citing high crimes and misdemeanors related to the violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act and the systematic obstruction of a congressional inquiry. Simultaneously, a special prosecutor was appointed by the Office of Government Ethics to investigate the criminal dimensions of the wire fraud and money laundering allegations. The Bondi precedent, as it came to be known, established a new standard for the scrutiny of executive officials with ties to international lobbying interests. It mandated that any capital movement through offshore jurisdictions by a high-ranking member of the cabinet would trigger an automatic, independent audit by the Government Accountability Office, effectively closing the Delaware loophole that had been utilized to obscure the $847,000 in transfers. The historical legacy of this event remains a cornerstone of 21st-century administrative law. It served as a definitive demonstration of the power of forensic metadata and suspicious activity reporting to hold even the highest law enforcement officers accountable to the rule of law. The 83 seconds of initial exposure by Senator Warren did not merely end a career. It initiated a profound recalibration of the relationship between private capital and public policy. As the sun set over the Potomac on the evening of the final hearing, the image of the navy blue folder remained a symbol of the inescapable reality that in an era of digital transparency, the paper trail is both indelible and absolute.